Joe Biden was not Sam Weinberg's top choice for the Democratic Party's nomination in 2020. But after Biden secured victory in the Democratic primary, the 19-year-old Illinois native set up Settle for Biden, an Instagram account using what he describes as sardonic millennial and Gen Z humor to convince young people to, well, settle for Biden. Well, Biden won the 2020 election, and many credit big turnout among young voters. Welcome back to inFocus with David Coletto. I'm your host, David Coletto from Abacus Data. On the podcast this week, I'm joined by John Della Volpe, the founder and CEO of SocialSphere. And for 21 years, he has been the director of polling at Harvard University's Institute of Politics, where he has led the research program exploring the attitudes and opinions of America's Millennials and Generation Z. John also recently served as a pollster for President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris's 2020 campaign, where he focused on youth research. John and I got to know each other over the past few years after he visited Ottawa in 2019. I had a lot of fun speaking with John. Hope you enjoy this episode. John, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm been a big fan since we met in Ottawa a few years ago, and I've been following your work even before I knew you through the work you do at the Institute of Politics at Harvard. I've been starting every conversation that I'm having with researchers with a question that gets at kind of their core framework or philosophy around public opinion. A big part of our course and my work is trying to look at the theory of public opinion and then applying it in the real world. So what do you feel is your kind of guiding light when it comes to the study of public opinion and its connection with then behavior?
David, thank you. And it's a real pleasure and honor to be with you today. I'm going to go a little bit off script, and I kind of channel the way in which I think about public opinion to an old rock song, actually, by U2. And what Bono wrote was that we thought we had the answers. It was the questions we had wrong, right? And what I'm referring to is that regardless of what subject I'm studying, and as you said, I've been fortunate enough at the Institute of Politics at Harvard to study youth now for 20 years, since when I was probably part of that category. But despite how much time I spend with young people or in any particular subject area, I kind of want to start from scratch, right? Start from scratch and begin by asking voters, members of the public, citizens, et cetera, in terms of what they care about today, right? That too often, I think pollsters, myself included, assume that people have well-informed opinions about things that we care deeply about, but don't necessarily fit within the context of their everyday life. So the very first place I always start is usually with qualitative, but it's to begin to ask myself and to ask the other members of our team, what are the questions that we really need to understand to help us understand the context of the lives that our constituents are living and how a campaign, a candidate, an issue kind of fits within that context.
So that theory or that approach assumes, which I think is a really interesting one, that, we're social scientists at core, and so people are pretty unpredictable. They change, and I think it forces us to reflect on our own biases, right? You're basically saying you start from scratch. You say, I don't believe that Americans generally, Canadians, have sort of a starting point, that what's happening in their day-to-day lives is actually the starting point. And so the questions matter as much as the answers in a way.
Especially in this era of, I know we'll talk about this era being like this century, last 20 years, whether it's a telephone survey, an online survey, a town meeting, a focus group, it would take me, and sometimes, our clients obviously have to have a little faith that we get there, and we always do, but it might take me half of a group or half of a survey before we're talking about the core issue at stake. I'll start the research exercise by asking, what's a good day, right? And I might hear, well, when I have more money in my checking account at 5 o'clock p.m. than 5 o'clock a.m., well, that's a good day. Okay. I might hear that when the public transportation arrives on time and I can get to work so I can hold on to my job, that's a good day. Okay. And that immediately grounds me, right? When my son or my daughter come home safely from school, right? That's a good day. So before we can talk about healthcare or the environment or any number of issues, understanding that context so critically important. Part one, and I think the other thing also is I spend a lot of time thinking about is their relationship and faith and trust in institutions, right? Whether they're public or private, to understand kind of where that relationship is, because typically we're working for people who are trying to persuade or influence public opinion. Those are the folks who have the resources, public, private, et cetera, and understanding the relationship in terms of how trusted that institution could be when they're trying to advocate for a position or a message is also a really important kind of grounding point before we can really begin the research.
It's so important, right? Like, again, you mentioned your clients. My clients always want to get to what they care about. But I always remind them, before you get to what you care about, you have to understand what does your audience care about. And we've actually started at the end of 2020 a project we're calling like the happiness monitor, right? It's just this overarching tracking of how Canadians are reporting their own happiness and looking at its connection between a range of things: what they buy, how they feel about public affairs or politics. And we're starting to see some really interesting relationships that change. They're dynamic, right? It's not constant. When the vaccines were announced that they were starting to be approved, we saw this like spike in national happiness. And then a few days later, our prime minister said, we might be second in line, third in line to get it. And we saw an instant sort of drop back down, right? And so that context is so important, really interesting. So, I mean, I don't want to pigeonhole you as the guy that only does youth research, but you've built a career, learning how young Americans are responding to their world and how politics fits in it. And it's something I'm passionate about too, and have kind of tried to replicate up here in Canada. So you've been studying those values and attitudes for, as you said, 20 years. If you had to summarize what you're seeing both today and over the course of the last 2 decades, how are young Americans different from older cohorts?
So I think there are a couple things. Now we've studied now 2 generations, right? We were fortunate that students are the ones, two undergraduates at Harvard were the ones who kind of thought of and created this project that 20 years later is still going. And the reason that they did it, Aaron and Trevor, who I'm still in some contact with, they wanted to understand the disconnect between service and politics. They saw that so many members of their own cohort on campus at Harvard, other colleges and high schools around the country were engaged in some meaningful form of community service, but they weren't so excited about voting. And they wanted to kind of understand through public opinion what we needed to do to bridge that gap. Within that context, again, we didn't start with politics. We started with what your life is like and what's meaningful. We realized that that millennials and certainly Gen Z today are different than other generations. I guess one is the way in which they think about problems in terms of highly collaborative. One of the most meaningful early responses that we found after 9/11, as an example, and it still holds true, is that younger Americans believe strongly, as in 2/3 to 3/4, that the UN and other nations ought to work collaboratively with the US to solve international crises and conflicts. Okay, and that was a majority of every single cohort, even conservative Republicans, as compared to older Americans who believed it should be the other way around. So that was like one of the earliest indications that we saw a pretty significant generation gap in terms of values. Even David, when back in 2000, younger and older Americans voted the same way. There was no generation gap in that Bush v. Gore. In fact, older Americans were a couple points more likely to vote Democrat than Republicans. So the idea of kind of the relationship with America and with kind of the global community is one significant value, I think, that is still different between younger and older Americans. That's one. The second thing is concern about inequality. Now, systemic racism we talk about, but back 4, 5, 6 years ago, I would say, if you really want to kind of understand the heart and mind of a younger person, you need to talk about rampant inequality, and that is around access to education, the economy, based upon gender, race, et cetera. Again, that's something that I think that transcends most cohorts from the ideological spectrum. Today, over the last 3 or 4 years since 2017, what I would say is the one characteristic that best defines young people today is sadly this like intense fear and anxiety. And I'm assuming that you're picking some of this up too in your happiness monitor up in Canada, but fear of their future, their health, for the environment, for safety. This is something that sadly I think really is a weight that young people carry. A brilliant young woman from Ohio State said to me in a focus group not too long ago, she said, the way that your generation, and I would ask her, like, what don't people like me understand, right? She goes, the way that your generation thinks about money, thinks about taxes, that's the way we think about living and dying. Okay. Every day we walk into a classroom, we're looking where the exits are in case there's a shooter, and how we're going to kind of get from A to B. So that's something that I think really needs to be, again, understood, because until we can unlock that fear, it's hard to have a conversation about some sort of political issue or other dynamic.
Do you think that, and I agree that fear is there. If you think about, I was born in 1981, so I'm like an really old millennial now. But if you take a look at my sort of adult life since I went away to school, and then every other generation, and the Gen Z that followed me, there have been these moments and events that have precipitated this sense that the world isn't as secure as I think many people raising us told us it would be. And that's the thing. It's like even this gap between expectations that I always talk about and reality. And, my grandparents raised my parents, boomers, to say, the world's tough. You've got to excel. We're going to give you maybe more than I had, but it's still a tough place, right? And you have to work hard, and you're not going to be given anything. I think younger generations were raised not to think that they're going to be given everything, but that it was a more secure place, right? And it doesn't feel that way. And I think, the existential crisis of climate change is just, this weight that younger generations are carrying with them. So the question that I always am asked, though, is, does that change over time, right? There's this, I'm not even going to call it a theory, because I don't necessarily think there's any evidence, but I'm curious on your point. You always hear that, when I release data that says young Canadians, are overwhelmingly in support of climate action, they see inequality, they're more likely to support a wealth tax than older Canadians. Everyone says to me, well, wait till they're 40, then that's all going to disappear. Do you think that's likely to happen, that we're going to see all these more progressive leaning young people shift as their life stage moves on?
I don't think there's been much evidence of that. So I think no, certainly not in recent time, because what we're talking about are real values, right? In terms of the way in which they think about their own lives and what their what their hopes and expectations are, right? So if you have a value of understanding that we should be allies and friends and work collaboratively with other nations, that's a value unlikely to change, right? If you see opportunity is closing and not opening for access to quality education, K through 12 or higher ed, that's unlikely to change, right? Most quote theory would say that values are determined during adolescence, right, to the early kind of adult years. So I haven't seen any much indication whatsoever that the generation that was raised like you, millennials, post 2000 and 2001, in terms of your voting, is really becoming any less likely to support Democrats when Democrats make an effort, right? The other quote value that I think is important to appreciate for younger Americans is, at least in our country, they don't always trust it, but they believe in the theory of a stronger government, a stronger, more active, not necessarily bloated or big, but they believe that the issues are so significant that's going to take everyone in terms of a collaboration, but led by government, to solve them. And that's something clearly where, like, my generation, Gen X, raised politically between Watergate and Reagan, is feels less strongly about that.
It's really interesting because I think the unit of measure when people do that analysis is often the cohorts or the people, right? But in fact, and they say, well, look, they're going to vote conservative or more conservative oriented party as they get older. I actually think the unit that we need to measure is change among the parties that adapt to the value set of the dominant generation of the time, right? So there's a lesson there that if, like in Canada, for example, right now, if you asked Canadians how would they vote in an election, the Conservative Party, I wouldn't equate them to the Republicans in the US. That wouldn't be maybe fair to conservatives here, depending on your political orientation. But, they're getting anywhere between 20 and 22% of the vote among young people in Canada, right? That compares to closer to 40 among older voters. So I tell conservatives, if you believe the status quo is going to get you to, those voters 10 years from now, then I think you're kind of dreaming. And so I think parties do adapt and because you always have to keep your audience in mind. And it's something we do, whether we're doing market research or political research. Now, you talked about the generational gap that really opened up over the last 20 years in American politics. As you said, like in 2000, my first kind of presidential election that I paid attention to was first year of university for me. You said there wasn't a generational gap in voting. And now we see pretty sharp divides, right? And we've seen that for some time. And I don't think the US is not alone. We see it in the UK even more so. Right. Class has been subsumed by generation as a guiding post in voting in the UK, I think largely because of Brexit and what that meant. In Canada, we've seen a persistent gap over the last few years. So just to sort of transition into the next section of our conversation, because you just finished, when we're recording this, a pretty exciting adventure. You were a pollster, one of the pollsters on the Biden-Harris campaign. And I was reading, in prepping for our discussion, an article about voter turnout, and you were quoted as saying, the challenge facing the Biden campaign was, throughout the primary, he wasn't, at least initially, the preferred choice among young Democrats. He may not have been even the preferred choice at the end of the process, even though he clearly won pretty substantially. Tell me a little bit about the challenge that you saw the Biden campaign having, in that the energy that candidates like Bernie Sanders, I think Elizabeth Warren to some extent, were able to create among that cohort wasn't there for Biden in the early days. And what did you see in the research you were doing that might have pointed in that direction? And then we'll get into your actual experience doing that, which, by the way, I'm incredibly jealous of. So tell me about the challenge that the Biden campaign had, because in my view, I don't think he would have won had it not been for the overwhelming turnout and differential in the youth vote. It's easy to point at different groups and say, without them, you couldn't win. But I'm pretty secure in saying if turnout didn't explode among young people, it may not have happened this time.
It's what an excellent question. So a couple of things. I believe for since 2004, really, that for a Democrat to win the presidency, that he or she needs to essentially reach 60% of the share vote among the under 30 crowd, generally speaking. Okay. Now, it's even more important today because there are fewer voters, because a lot of the millennials have graduated into their 30s, that we kind of get that margin. So that's kind of where we start. John Kerry and Hillary Clinton got about 55%. Obama got 66 and 60%. Okay, so that's kind of where we start. A generic Democrat starts somewhere in the mid 50s or so. Okay, so many ways for Republicans to counter that, right? By earning more votes, third party candidates, there's lots of different ways and dynamics for this to play out. The last significant, the last public poll that I was part of was at the IOP that was fielded in March as the primaries were essentially wrapping up. And at that time, David, I was slightly surprised that there was no gap in a horse race between Biden and Trump compared to Sanders versus Trump. In both cases, Sanders and Biden scored, 60, 61%, despite the fact, as you said, that, that Sanders probably had a 3-to-1 advantage, right? When you look at the share of the youth vote over the course of that Democratic primary. In fact, the net favorability for Biden in that poll, or in other public polling around that time, was like -22, -23. So he was underwater, but he was getting the benefit of the doubt. So that's that's better than other circumstances, right? And really kind of the focus from the first conversations I had was to take that, what we would call a very soft supporter, right, and to try to understand why they were soft, and obviously kind of develop strategy, communications, otherwise to build more enthusiasm to make that kind of a stronger, more reliable supporter. Something, frankly, that many campaigns, I think, kind of take for granted. They'll look at that poll and say, hey, we're at 60%, great. Now let's, take these resources and invest in other places. But I can tell you from the very first conversation I ever had with then Vice President Biden, several years ago, where we kind of met at a dinner, he was always focused on understanding the youth vote. And I believe through those conversations that it was really a challenge of communications rather than anything else. That the values that he has espoused, his life journey, is more connected than young people realized during that primary. And that I felt confident that if we were able to kind of show and tell that story, then things would work out okay.
And I think, this is my own opinion, I think you were successful at that, right? I think that's the best, that's such a good way of describing it, is there was an inclination to vote for him. There was certainly, Trump repelled many people. So you already had a natural place, and we can't ignore that. Like, you were up against somebody who most young Americans would say, I want nothing to do with, and doesn't align at all with how I see the world, or what I think the most powerful country in the world should be doing and saying, its leader should be saying on a day-to-day basis. But it feels to me that over the course of the campaign, things that Biden did, that he said himself, but also, selecting Ms. Harris as his running mate, signaled that he was acting on what he said he would do, right? And even in we're recording this in December, even in the lead up to his transition and his announcements of who he's appointing to his cabinet, and it's clear he's following through. And I think that is where a lot of young people fall down, is that they, it's great to say something, but it's another thing to actually do it. And I think that really did help over the campaign. So the last section of little bit of time we have left, I want to get into the practical side of working on a presidential campaign, as much as you're able to share. First, how was that experience?
It was incredible. Clearly, one of the very best experiences, professional otherwise, I've ever had. A handful of folks, I've had a relationship with over the years. Some I've read about and heard about, and others, so many of them were new and certainly kind of a challenge based on everything basically being on Zoom. But I've just learned so much about politics, about communication, about interpersonal relationships, about how to manage, basically kind of a startup to ramp up from nothing to, to thousands of employees and $1 billion budget. So incredible experience and the best, kindest, most thoughtful people I've ever engaged with.
And you won.
And we won. Yes.
Which,
and we won.
it's just not really the cherry on the top. It's the most important thing.
Exactly.
But it still feels good when that happens. So one of the interesting things that, for Canadian listeners is different is, first is the scale of a presidential campaign versus even a national campaign for one of the large political parties here in Canada is just the amount of resources you have to do research. And maybe in a typical election year in Canada, a party that has money might spend a few $1 million on research total and have one person kind of coordinating it. You were one of 4 or 5 others that were, doing research and advising the campaign, feeding, public opinion data into it. How does that work in terms of the dynamics of that? And I mean, you were focused, correct me if I'm wrong, on youth. That was kind of your primary focus, but how did it kind of work in that kind of
I think it was one of the best decisions that the campaign and Mike Donilon really made to set this up. And in presidential campaigns, there are typically kind of teams of pollsters. Right? With a chief, you need to have one chief pollster, and we had one, John Anzalone, right, who has had relationship with President Biden now for decades and is has worked on many presidential campaigns. Essentially, we had 2 main pollsters, John Anzalone and Celinda Lake, have been working for presidentials and governor's races and Senate races for many years, 2 of the very, very best people and pollsters I've ever worked with. They were in charge of essentially managing the battleground research. Okay, so quantitative and qualitative in each of those states, that was their and their team's responsibility. In addition, and I think this is the real innovation that I hope and expect that Democrats will use, is that we had 3 maybe call us subject matter experts, right? I was tasked with focusing on the youth vote. We had another pollster and colleague, Silas Lee, sociology professor from Louisiana, focusing on the African-American vote. Again, with a different kind of perspective, engaged with politics, but also bringing the sociological background. And then we had Matt Barreto from Latino Decisions on the West Coast, focusing on Hispanic vote as well. And of course, within that, we each had our own specialties, women, seniors, et cetera. But having that team where everyone worked with each other, right? So I would analyze the battleground youth polling, okay? They would then help me craft certain messages for my polling. It was, a real kind of collaborative effort. And I would argue that in the future, we need to do more, not less, of that subject matter specific, right? We need to have someone maybe like me who can really focus on, younger rural voters, right? Who may have a specialty in that, or go deeper into any one of the important demographic groups that are a challenge to poll these days.
And I take it you probably become, as you said, a subject matter expert that's sought after by different parts of the campaign, right? So while you might be feeding your insights into the center strategy team, right, that's thinking about the big picture decisions, were you also called upon to brief, the digital team and the fundraising and other aspects that, because you have this unique insight into one key demographic, you actually become this source of intelligence that can guide so much of the campaign.
And I think that was one of the great parts of this campaign, which our campaign manager, Jen O'Malley Dillon, did so well, is that kind of bring in the different elements of the organization, from social, digital, to paid media, communications, surrogates, right? Local organizers. Obviously, I was working with the college team as well. So there was a multiple discipline organization, seeing kind of the effect and the insights from our research. And what was so important is we needed to do 2 things, right? We needed to build that relationship with then Vice President Biden, now President Biden. But we also needed to build trust with the actual process of voting and governing. Okay, so it's not just about being the best guy, but being the best guy who's got the opportunity and knows how to solve the challenges that young people care about. It's a two-for. And that perspective for youth is different, I think, in the way in which that's guided than you might get from other cohorts that were kind of spoken with. So, yeah, and the questions that I would get from the coalition's director and from a state director and surrogates director were so incredibly important to informing what I ask about as well.
Just briefly, can you give us a sense of the scale of research being done on a presidential campaign? Like, is there just, constant daily tracking polls of all the different groups you talked about? It's like, how many focus groups were you doing? Were you doing any? I guess it's hard with COVID that maybe they're all virtual, but what was going on the day-to-day in terms of the scale and volume of research?
So there's a couple of different tracks, right? There's an analytics department, and then there's the polling department. The analytics team, of which was not a part of, I don't know a lot about, but they're constantly in the field conducting surveys to add to their models. So constantly tracking from the summer through the fall on that side. On our side, we have a public opinion director who was terrific, Julia Kennedy, who's organizing all of our activities. And essentially, we're in a regular cadence with essentially, the dozen plus or minus key states, tracking and being in touch with them basically on a regular basis from June through November, ramping up as you get closer to November. We would have tier 1 states and tier 2 states. Those could, I think Georgia was probably not a tier 1 state when we started. Obviously, we know where that ended. So there's a constant flow of information, from the analytics department, but also from kind of the team of pollsters, every couple of weeks, maybe every month, based upon where the split was. For me, whenever I would do focus groups, just focus on young people, I would focus on those tier 1 or tier 2 states. I do half dozen, 8, 10 focus groups at a time, all virtual, So I could look at different groups, older, relatively speaking, suburban women in their 30s, right, was an important cohort, maybe in Western Pennsylvania, independent-minded men, in Central Florida, college students, first-time voters, very progressive, Sanders, Warren kinds of folks, high school, Latino. So when you think about even within youth, the groups that we need to connect with in order to inform our survey, it adds up pretty quickly. Thankfully, we had the resources to be able to achieve that and to be very flexible. We didn't know what the scope of our program was going to be when we began developing it months before the campaign, actually, months before the fall. So, that's the flexibility that I think the campaign was able to develop, both because of the success of fundraising, but also the multiple path strategy that was so critically important to our success.
So interesting. So to wrap up, so now I guess to end this conversation, it's all about where to next. And from looking from north of you here, there's no doubt that America is as divided as probably it's ever been. It remains that way. And the goal and the hopes, I think, of people is that division might cease. Do you get a sense, though, that, and this is what drives my thinking on it, is we no longer even agree on the problems, right? It used to be, I think, even in the 60s and 70s, which were pretty tumultuous periods of American history, global history, most people still agreed what the problem was. We just debated how to solve it. But when I look at public opinion data and I look at what Democrats and Republicans say are the actual issues that we need to deal with, they're on completely different worlds, it feels like. Do you see that being able to change over time, or is this just the normal? It's not new. It's the normal that a president and a political system has to just manage.
It depends upon the definition of like what the timeline is, I think. You know, longer term, I'm very optimistic. Um, because of what we've talked about, and because of the values of younger Americans now defined by people under the age roughly of 40, right? And whereas it's a divided nation, for people under 40, it's more of a 2/3, 1/3, not 50-50, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is some kind of collective interest, I think, in solving some of the challenges that we have. Short term trajectory, I'm kind of less optimistic just because of this like incredible cultural divides, you know, and the feeling of helplessness, I think, in many places. And one of the more interesting, I think, statistics from the campaign was that, have you looked at the county data, the county level data? Brookings um, uh, Institute released a report which said that the Biden counties that he won, only several hundred, okay, for maybe 400 and change, whereas Trump won 2,500 counties, 2,400 counties. And of the small number of counties that Biden won, they represent 75% of our GDP or our economy. Um, and what that means is that basically the influencers, the tastemakers, right, corporations are speaking to that part of America, to the blue America that supported Biden, and they're not speaking to the 2,000 plus counties that supported Trump, which I think is not going to be helpful, right? It's going to further, I think, certainly not going to be helpful to bridging these divides. So short term, I think that's another kind of cross pressure in terms of Hollywood, TV, corporations, marketing executives, et cetera, and we're chasing the money in the blue, not the red counties. So that's going to be a challenge. And of course, that just kind of gets into what you mentioned, is the lack of understanding of what our collective challenges are, which is around thought bubbles and Facebook and cable TV and Fox and other things. Longer term, I've got faith. Short term, it's going to be a very, very significant challenge.
That's a really interesting perspective. It's obvious, but we never think of it, that not just our political elites that encourage kind of the tribalism in a way, but in fact, just commercial interests are driving people apart, right?
Capitalism.
Yeah. Like, as much as Nike sees a path to growth and connection with its customers by putting a political flag down and saying, we stand for this, which half the country would say, I agree with, but 90% of its customers say, I love, it's not speaking to the other half who say, well, what about me, right? It's a whole other conversation for another day. But the fact that, in the United States, you have a fried chicken place that caters to Republicans and a fried chicken joint that caters to Democrats is a unique feature of our times, and I think is something to think about. Well, John, hey, this was so much fun, and thanks for sharing and spending some time with us. Stay safe, and I can't wait to see what you do next.
Likewise, this was something I've been looking forward to for a while, so thanks for having me, David. Appreciate it.
Take care.